This lovely parable that we get today from the Gospel of Luke is known as the most challenging, most difficult, most confusing, or flat out worst parable of them all, depending on which commentator you listen to. There's not one commentary that I read or heard this week that didn't say something along the lines of challenging, difficult, confusing, or just plain the worst. This parable only happens in Luke's gospel, and I have to wonder if the writers of Matthew and Mark decided it was just too much and therefore left it out of their stories. We're left wondering, what in the world is Jesus trying to say? What are we supposed to learn from this parable where no one seems to be doing the right thing, where the one who is commended is also called dishonest? What is going on in this parable, we wonder? And as with all parables, it can be unhelpful at best and dangerous at worst to try to decide who in the story mirrors people in our world, ourselves, or God. Take, for example, the rich man. If we assume that the rich man is supposed to represent God, then what we are saying is that God is a God who will hear charges brought against one of God's children and dismiss them outright, with no chance for them to explain themselves or ask for forgiveness. Certainly this is not something we believe about God, so God can't be the rich man. He could be the manager, but if God is the manager, then God is not in charge, and that brings up a whole host of other issues. When we start to try to mix ourselves or those in our world into this parable, it gets more confusing, more challenging. And so perhaps this parable in particular is one that we should set aside and not try to read ourselves or others into. Perhaps this one in particular needs to be one we see and then try to explain some other way. It's helpful that at the end of the parable we get a little bit of discourse from Jesus, a little bit about the parable itself, and then this other piece that comes right after. It may be that Jesus said these things right after saying the parable in the actual order of events, or it may be that the writer of Luke said, maybe this is what Jesus was trying to tell us, and so when the writer wrote the gospel, put this discourse afterward. Jesus says two things in what he says after the parable. First, he says that those who are faithful with little will receive much more, and vice versa. We hear this from other parables of Jesus and other times when he speaks to his disciples. Those who are faithful with a little will be given more to be faithful with, for they have proven they can be trusted. But the other thing Jesus says is fairly unique to this parable. Jesus says, no slave can serve two masters. For you'll either start to hate one or the other and be completely devoted to the other one. And then he specifically says, you cannot serve God and wealth. Jesus says these two things cannot happen at the same time. You cannot serve God and wealth. It's interesting, especially when we pair it with this text from Jeremiah that talks about idol worship, that Jesus doesn't bother to bring those 10 commandments into his discourse about not being able to serve two masters. For in the 10 commandments we hear God proclaim, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make an idol of anything. Jesus could have brought this in and said, this is why you cannot serve two masters. You can only serve God. All other serving in that way is idol worship. Often we think of idol worship as making some sort of image and bowing down to it. But idol worship comes in all sorts of forms. A few weeks ago, we heard Jesus tell his disciples that no one who didn't hate their family and their very lives themselves could actually follow him. And when we talked about that text, we talked about the fact that it means that in comparison to how much we love God, it will seem as if we hate even those things that we love most in this world. And this, too, is what Jesus is talking about here. It's not that we're not allowed to love other things. It's that if the love of those things comes before our love and our service to God, then we are participating in idol worship. You cannot serve God and wealth, Jesus says. Perhaps because wealth or power or status are the things that we most often turn to when we begin to turn to idol worship. You cannot serve God and wealth. But perhaps we can serve God with our wealth. And in light of that, I wonder if we go back into the parable, thinking about how we cannot serve God and wealth, maybe it will make a little bit more sense. For we enter this parable and hear of a manager who has been cheating his master out of money. Those who are below him, those who are his subordinates, have tattled on him, for they have seen that their manager is stealing from their master, and they are being loyal to their master. It seems that this manager was trying to serve both his master and his own gain. But you cannot do both kinds of things. And so he was failing miserably at both. This manager, according to the story, was trying to get more and more stuff, more power, more money, more status for himself. In the way society worked in Jesus' day, this manager has probably reached the height of his ability to raise up his social status. So maybe now he's using that height of social status to increase his own wealth. But when he does so, when he thinks only of himself, when he thinks only of gaining more and more money and power and status, he's unaware, I assume, of how much harm he is causing the whole system. He is causing himself harm because he can have no good relationships with his subordinates who see him stealing from them and from his master. He has no good relationship with his master for the same reason. But he's not just hurting himself and his relationships. He's hurting his master's reputation. For if he is stealing from his master, the master will either seem like a cruel and unforgiving one who charges high rates of interest, or will be seen as one who can't even keep an account of his own stuff. He's hurting those below him, because one way or another he is stealing from them, either adding to their bill or making it seem that they're not paying their master back fast enough. When he thinks only of gaining for himself, the manager is destroying the whole system. He is doing harm and evil to everyone across the board, including himself, the one for whom he thinks he's working. But when he's in trouble, when he thinks he is going to lose his job, his status, his power, his wealth, all of it, then he begins to think about what he can do. He's still thinking only of himself, but he is thinking of himself in relation to other people. And so even though he comes from a place of selfishness and evil, the manager begins to do good across the system. The manager does good for those below him because he erases some of their debt, something that was certainly hanging over their heads. The first one who comes to him owes 100 barrels of oil, which was an equivalent of 1,000 days' wages, seemingly an insurmountable debt to pay the master. And half of that debt is canceled because of the manager's desire to help himself by creating new relationships with others. He also does good for his master in this selfishness, for he makes his master seem more forgiving. kind, benevolent even, for he is canceling his master's debts. And so those who are below will see the master as someone who cares about them. The manager is creating new relationships across these divides and relationships for himself. Of course, this is his selfish goal, to find people who will take care of him. But in trying to do good so that they will do good in return, he changes the whole system. And I wonder if this, just maybe, is the point of the parable. That if the manager, in seeking selfish gain, but doing good, can do so much good, how much more good can we, when we enter with good intentions, do for the whole system, the whole world? Perhaps what Jesus is trying to enforce is that when we love and serve God above all else, when we do good, our good increases throughout those with whom we have relationships. For if this manager, in thinking selfishly, can do this much good, how much more can we do if we think unselfishly, if we think out of concern and care for those around us? Maybe we can't find ourselves in this parable because we should be those who owe great debts, those who time and time again have turned from God. We have sinned miserably. We have a mountain of debt, it seems, to God. But God, in love and grace and mercy, forgives all that debt, not 50% or 20% or somewhere in between. God forgives all that debt in the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. And so we are freed from a system that looks like this parable. And maybe that's why we can't find ourselves in it. For we have been set free, and we have been called to greater things than concerning ourselves all the time with what our debt is and how to pay it off. We have been called to receive this grace and mercy, love and forgiveness, and then turn around and pour it out on those around us. We have received abundantly, and we have been called to give abundantly. We have been given much and called to be faithful with much. And so Jesus sends us out, even in this confusing and challenging and difficult and perhaps worst of all parables. Jesus sends us out to fill the world with love and grace and mercy and forgiveness. Jesus sends us out, and the question remains, if we cannot serve God and wealth, how can we serve God with the wealth of what we have been given? Amen.